Hello, people of the internet, and welcome. My name is Daniel K. Hargrove, also known as Daniel the DM, and today we're here to talk about why Final Fantasy VII is kind of like the perfect D&D campaign. Now, listen, I already know there's the long history of JRPGs and them being influenced by Dungeons and Dragons and vice versa, and the whole entire role-playing genre as a whole and how that intertwines between tabletop and in the video game sphere. But I really want to talk about this as to how it pertains to how we play D&D today, right? In the age of the actual play and streaming and all these different things. I wanted to talk about some of the lessons that we can learn from the world building to what players can do and how characters are handled and characterization and character arcs are handled in Final Fantasy VII, and how we can learn some lessons from that, what we can extrapolate from this game series and possibly apply later on down the line in our own games. All right, so that's what we're trying to do. And the reason we're even doing this in the first place is because I've been watching too many Final Fantasy VII lore videos. I'm a big Final Fantasy VII fan in general, as you can tell by the cloud figurine in the background. And yeah, I've just been super excited, and I've been doing a lore run over on twitch.tv/Daniel the DM, and that's also multi-streamed here vertically on YouTube. But I've just been doing this lore run, and I love going through and talking about these games and theorizing what might happen in the third part of the remake trilogy. So, you know, that's what spurred all this on in the first place. But with all that being said, before we get into my 4 points that I really want to get into, I just wanted to say thank you to my patrons over on patreon.com/Daniel K. Hargrove. You all are keeping the lights on over here, and I greatly appreciate it. If you want to show your appreciation in any way, shape, or form, it's pay whatever you want over there, whatever you think the content is worth, or whatever you can afford. I would greatly appreciate it. And there's also a free tier that gets you access to the Discord, and let me know what we should do with the Discord. I don't know. I need ideas of what we can do with it. But with all that being said, let's hop into this and let's talk about Final Fantasy VII. So the first thing I want to talk about is scale. One of the best things about Final Fantasy VII is the scale of the story. It starts off so small. It starts off on the train, the first bombing run, and it gets you immediately invested into the world, the story, the lore, and the conflict. And it sets that up from the very beginning. And that's not something that every single story has to do. If you want to start at the tavern, you're more than welcome to do so. But one of the things that's so engaging about the opening, and it has to be because you're in a video game that's, you know, has a finite amount of time to tell its story, and you don't often find that at your D&D table, right, where you like have to tell your story within a certain amount of time unless you're doing an actual play to a certain degree or a one-shot. But with telling this story, it immediately gets you involved in the world and sets up the stakes, right? And I think that's something that we as dungeon masters, we as storytellers, game masters, whatever you want to call yourself, creating that opening is so important. The opening and what gets your characters involved is super important. And again, it's okay to start off your story with the slow burn building into the exciting incident. But I think that very first session, I think that very first game should establish the tone. It should establish some sense of urgency to a certain degree. There should be some level of action that your characters take to show who who those characters are, right? Created those scenarios to where it's putting your players in a position to reveal who they are. Right? When we're looking at the bombing run and we look at the actions that certain members take, you have members like Jesse, you know, and them who are engaging with the officers that are there, but they have their own specialties and things they're doing that they're involved with that make them contribute to the team. And then you have someone who's ruthless, like Cloud, and taking people out left and right and all that sort of stuff. And you have Barrett, who's taking command and has this very boisterous personality in the very beginning because he is this leader in the beginning trying to lead these rebels on a cause that the odds feel way too stacked against them, right? So immediately what we're seeing at the opening of Final Fantasy VII are the stakes. We're seeing the world, we're getting the characterization, and there's not a lot of lore truly that's there in the beginning besides establishing like who Shinra is, who Avalanche is, what a soldier is to a certain degree, what Mako is, right? The basics of the world are established, and it gives you the sense of what's at stake, right? And some of the conflicts that are there. And when we even want to apply this to, say, starting at the tavern, like in a D&D game, okay, but what if they're starting at the tavern and then the Imperial army comes in and tries to take over the bar for their own party, right? They try to kick out the patrons who include our D&D party, right? The actions that they take when that happens can be a big reflection of the world that your character's living in. Okay, is this town under some form of occupation, right? Are some of the players going to try to fight back, muscle up? Right? That's one way to show who they are and immediately establish who they are and the stakes that are within them. You have the other party member who might try to steal something from the guards. Maybe they need like a key card or a key that they want to use for later for their own personal motivations and story related stuff. Maybe you have that one character who's very charismatic and tries to be diplomatic to make sure nobody else gets kicked out and that there is no fight, right? It doesn't matter where your story starts, but in that opening, you should create the opportunity to allow players to establish who they are and to create opportunity to allow your world to present itself, right? And to establish what sort of stakes could be there immediately, right? Even if you're not doing the inciting incident where the party goes and steals a magical artifact or they learn about a dragon or a lich, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You just want some fun role play that starts off at a tavern. That doesn't mean you can't do some of that legwork of getting started with building your world and getting people invested into the setting, right? But that kind of brings me on to my next point where we're talking about always keeping things personal. Final Fantasy VII, as massive as the scale gets, right? It starts off small and then it goes grandiose. Eventually, by the end of the story, you're flying around in a skyship, you're battling these alien entities, you're fighting kaiju, you're doing all this stuff, and it gradually builds to that, which is a part of that scale that makes the story so great, while interspersing moments of levity and engagement and world building all throughout and in between. But the characters are always written to where the story and the stakes are personal, right? There's always a personal investment within the party to want to stay on this journey and to continue staying on this journey. And I think this is more so something that for those of us who are players at the table, that we can extrapolate from this story and apply to our own D&D games, right? Or TTRPG games. When we look at characters like Cloud and Barrett, Tifa and Aerith, right? They're always personally connected to what's happening, right? Even if they may not be directly related to what's happening within the plot in that current point of time, they're always finding a reason to be involved in the story. And I think about it when it comes to actual plays and how we have this now. Oftentimes, when people are getting into D&D, there's kind of like this conflicting two roads that people start to go down, where they create these isolated characters that just have their own personal motivations, but they don't really gel with the plot. And I've been with in those games, and it feels so frustrating when you have those characters that just feel like a floating island that aren't attached to anything that's happening. They talk about how much their character doesn't care or wouldn't want to be involved or wouldn't want to be motivated to do anything. And that makes for such an uninteresting character and it makes someone who weighs down the story and weighs down the plot and weighs down the party to have someone who's not invested, right? And it's up to you as a player to find that investment in your character and to find those motivations and to shift those motivations as a story evolves, right? Cloud as a character is only interested in this story because it's a favor for Tifa, and he only does the bobbing run because he needs the money. He wakes up having issues with his memory and he needs money. He's good at being a mercenary, so that's what he does. Point blank and simple. That's a simple motivation, right? That's borderline I'm just here, I'm just here, the cool guy, the nonchalant, I don't care what happens. Like he starts off as the dark loner rogue in the bar, right, at the tavern, who doesn't care about anything and is just here for this first job. But his motivations change as the story goes along. He gets invested in the cause. He gets invested because of Sephiroth. He gets invested because of what's happening to Aerith, and he cares about the history of what's going on, right? His motivation shifts to always want to be engaged with the story. And obviously that's just good writing. But when we apply that to our storytelling as players, right? We have to make that the cognizant choice to shift why our characters want to be involved, right? And I think about that in the sense of like we said with the rogue who sits there in the back of the bar, doesn't want to be involved with anybody. Well, you got to find a reason. Well, you've got to find a reason, and you got to be personally involved. And part of that too also relates to the game master, because you have to create a world that engages and entices characters on a personal level, right? What about the Crown's Guard really makes that druid who's a part of the party mad? Are they deforesting so much of the land around them because of industrialization? They invented a new technology. Maybe they invented war forges, and that's creating all new sorts of innovation, right? Maybe something else is going on, but it's as much as the players are there and have to find that motivation, you also have to, as storytellers, create things that keep the players involved. But at the end of the day, always make sure that things feel personal, right? Because as the scale of the story increases, and we watched that with Final Fantasy VII, everything stays personal. Right? It's always about these characters and what they mean to each other, and the camaraderie that they find within one another, and the comfort and how they help each other overcome what they are going through, not only within combat, but within mentally as well, and the things that they're tackling. There is this constant state of growth or regression, depending on parts of the story that are happening within these characters. Regardless, there's always something happening. And whatever is happening, even if it's not directly related to their lives, is affecting the characters personally. And I think that's something we could all learn from at our tables, and making sure that we're internalizing that, and that we're shifting that within our stories, right? And that kind of brings me into the next part that I wanted to bring up, which is making death matter, right? There's obviously a very famous death in Final Fantasy VII. Some people still don't know to this day, but hey, there is a very famous death that happens. But I think the most important point about that death in Final Fantasy VII is that the void is never filled when that character leaves the story, right? When that character is gone, you also feel that mechanically, right? Like, that is the best spellcaster in the entire game is gone. There is this void that can never be filled when that party member leaves. And I think that's something we can keep in mind more when it comes to the stories that we're telling, right? Especially in games like 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, there's so many ways to easily access resurrection. Whether it's Revivify, the resurrection spell, Revivify scrolls, etc. Maybe certain deals that can be made, but there's many different ways to try to avoid death. But when it does happen and it sticks, in order to truly drive it home, there needs to be something that can't be made whole, right? There's a permanent loss in that party composition. And I think of that lately in my games. Currently, I'm in a game called Fears and Fortunes. We're on our 4th season. So I've been with the character of Aaron Drivelhog, my fighter Dragonborn. I've been with him for 4 seasons. I've spent, over 100 hours as his character, right? And I think about now, as we enter the late stages of this story, and as the stakes increase and the enemies get harder, what would happen if he were to die in combat, right? And there was no way to resurrect him in time, and we couldn't make that happen. What would happen to him? And what would happen in this story? And I realized, I was like, if that were to happen, I couldn't come back as that same frontline fighter. I don't want to fill that same void of Aaron is the person who is the 2-weapon wielding, whirling dervish, Gish sort of character, right? He is going in, he's blasting and casting, but also slashing and dashing. Okay, he's in there, he's in the mix, right? Was a fighter, now turned paladin wizard mix. It's a whole thing. You gotta watch the show, right? But I say all that to say that if he were to die, I would have to come back as something entirely different. I would never want to fill that void that he has there in the combat. Sure, this might be a character that brings some levity, or they find new inspiration with this character, or relate to this character, or find new dynamics and relationships if I were to bring in a new character. That's great. But I should never be that same character again. There's another game that does this more so recently that is heavily inspired by Final Fantasy VII, and that being Expedition 33, where they do a character death, a major character death early on. And my problem with that was they're immediately replaced with somebody who uses the same exact weapons and the same exact abilities. And that's why I'm like, they didn't quite, even though they were very heavily inspired by Final Fantasy and specifically Final Fantasy VII, to me, that moment kind of missed the mark, because it's like, yeah, but the point is, like in death and like in real life, if you can't perfectly replace someone, right? And I think that's so important, because you can find so much more depth in storytelling when you let death actually hold its place there within a party composition, within a dynamic, and truly let it sit there and let it morph and change and evolve the characters, right? Make it matter in your games. And I think you will find something that's much more enriching. And I'm not talking about just like, okay, let's crank up the difficulty of the games, make it harder, and start killing players left and right. I'm just saying, when the circumstances happen, let them happen and feel it. Grieve through the characters and internalize what that process looks like for them. And then you're going to make something much more engaging and memorable. And it makes the memory of that character prior even more powerful. That got a bit heavy. So let's move on to our final point. Add a little bit of levity here onto this. One of the lessons that we can learn from Final Fantasy VII that we can apply to our D&D games is that we need more magic items in our games. Dungeon masters have been too stingy nowadays, okay? Everyone's afraid of breaking the game. I get it. However, my counter argument is that giving players a bunch of cool stuff is fun. And also, attunement exists for a reason, right? Equipment weight can exist, depending on if you use the rules for that or not, or depending on the system that you're playing, exists for a reason. Because I think one of the cool things about the materia system that you see in Final Fantasy VII and the weapon system is that it gives you so many different choices and variety that open up the builds that you could create with the base of what a character can do. And that is super, super fun and super, super engaging. However, right, part of the problem is that you have limited slots for your materia, right? So you have to be thinking critically about what pieces that you put together in order to craft that sort of build. And I think the same thing can be applied to magic items in D&D, whether it's certain potions, giving players more potions or scrolls or magical weapons, all this sort of stuff. I feel like maybe it's just most games that I've played, but also most games that I've seen in actual plays as well. I mean, there are like hundreds of items out there that never get used in most campaigns, and no one ever looks and throws them in there. And everyone is so stingy with giving out cool stuff. Give out more cool stuff. Do it. Throw it out there. Let it happen. I guarantee you, balancing is not as scary as people make it out to be. It is really, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I don't find balancing that difficult when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons or Daggerheart, any of that sort of stuff. I think there are ways to make sure that characters are challenged within combat, no matter the level that they find themselves in. And also it brings me back to what I was saying earlier, that you have to make the stakes high as well emotionally. Not just the threat of what could happen to the characters physically, thinking about their communities, thinking about them in their interpersonal relationships and the stake of what failure means. There's so many different ways just beyond the blatant threat of being bludgeoned to death by the enemy in front of you of what failure could be in a certain circumstance, right? give out more cool items. It's sick. It's cool. Everybody loves shiny stuff, but also it creates more decision making. And I think also in a way creates more interesting and engaging stories when people start to use things in different ways, right? And we'll use things that are maybe suboptimal, but it does this really cool thing or something that's more engaging for this moment and gives more options in that regard. Give out more cool stuff, all right? Treat stuff like materia, where it's like you're throwing a whole bunch of stuff out there, maybe a bit more stuff that requires attunement, but you're giving people options and allowing for people to experiment with more things. And also, I think magic items open up, and other items in general, open up more opportunities to talk about lore and opportunities to expand the world building, etc. I'm just saying, that doesn't have to apply to every single setting. You know, so if you're doing a low magic system, a low magic item sort of system, okay, you know, by all means, you know, make sure that you're reserved in what you're giving out. But I think it's worth considering, and especially giving people a sort of iconic weapon, right? Giving them an item that feels like a Buster Sword, that feels like the Cerberus, right? Giving them items that feel like a personalized weapon that they can grow with is also an option as well. Not just giving out a bunch of cool stuff, maybe one item that just keeps getting upgraded as this story progresses within the limits of like tiers of play and all that sort of stuff, right? But with all that being said, these are my reasons why I'm like, hey, Final Fantasy VII is kind of like the perfect D&D campaign. From the world building to the lore to the way the dungeons are laid out and the inspirations you can find there and the setups for puzzles and ways to split the party. There's so many things you could learn and extrapolate and maybe apply to your own games if they fit if you go and play those games. I highly, highly recommend it, be it the original or the remake trilogy. I think there's so much to extrapolate from other forms of media in general. And we all know this. But yeah, it's just such a great time going back and playing this game. I love playing this game and talking about this game. And if you enjoy talking about this game, hey, join the lives. Twitch.tv/Daniel the DM. But that's me. That's it. That's all I've got to say. Everyone, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and have a good one.